Scratchboard artists. Today I wanted to do a video on how to varnish your scratchboard artwork because this is certainly one of the most frequently asked about questions in the scratchboard community that I have seen, and it was certainly one of the biggest learning curves for me. Over the last year, I have learned a lot from Ampersand themselves, as well as picking other artists' brands on how they varnish, and of course by trial and error. So today I wanted to put that all together in hopes that it will help those of you new to scratchboard wanting to get your pieces sealed and protected. Before I do a demonstration, we will go over everything you absolutely must know before you attempt to varnish your work. We will go over weather, instructions, tips from Ampersand, fixing snow, storage, protective gear, and of course, we'll get to the demonstration after that. Oh, and I briefly want to touch on the types of varnish before we start. So you will want to buy a spray varnish. You cannot use a wet brush application varnish because it will smear the black ink. As for the spray varnishes, there tend to be two more popular brands in the scratchboard community, which are Krylon and Golden. I know that Krylon is more difficult to obtain worldwide, but there are plenty of other brands out there. You just want to make sure that you get an archival spray fixative that is UV protected. You will also need to decide on the type of finish that you'd like. Typically, there is matte, satin, semi-gloss, and gloss. I prefer the satin varnish that is a mix between the matte and the gloss surfaces, but I know a lot of other scratchboard artists do like the matte. I also want to note that before we begin, that this is just what I have learned and what has worked for me in learning to varnish my work. It's going to take a lot of practice and for you learning what works for you. I'm sure there are plenty other ways and opinions on how to varnish, and all these factors come into play here, but hopefully this helps you get a jump start on it and then just taking a lot of practice to figure out what works for you. So on that note, let's go ahead and dive in. The first topic we are going to talk about is weather, specifically humidity and wind. These are huge factors when it comes to varnishing your piece. Unless you are lucky enough to have a large room or studio in which you can varnish indoors, disclaimer, I would not recommend spraying indoors as it is very toxic. Let's assume you're going to be varnishing outdoors or in an open garage or somewhere like that. First, let's talk about humidity. The issue that humidity brings to varnishing is that the spray can pick up tiny moisture particles and trap them, creating small white bumps on the artwork. This is called snow. This happened to me on my first time varnishing, and I emailed Ampersand in a panic. Luckily, there is a fix, which I will go over later in this video. But it is definitely best when you varnish to choose a low humidity day and also midday when it's at its warmest and driest. So I live in San Diego, California, and although we do have a lot of humid mornings with the marine layer, we are sunny most of the year, so it does make it pretty easy for me to varnish most of the time, minus the coastal breeze, which definitely provides a little bit of a challenge. I unfortunately am not experienced in varnishing in states where it snows, but I have come across a scratchboard artist who lives in a state where it snows, and she actually built a closed off and sealed off easy up tent in her garage, and she led a pipe from the house to the tent in which it pumped the warm heater air from the house into the tent, which was just brilliant. So if you're up for the challenge, you might want to give that a go. Continuing on with weather, you will also want to factor in the wind, because when you're varnishing, your piece is going to be wet, and if dust particles get stuck on it when it's drying, they could become embedded. If you see dust particles land on your piece when it's drying, let that layer dry before you attempt to take it off. Sometimes it's just as easy as simply very carefully brushing it off with your finger. Other times, if they become pretty embedded in there, you might need to try and use a fine needle or the tip of your X-Acto blade to kind of wedge it out. But be very careful with this because it can leave a mark. However, once you continue to build up those varnishing layers, it should hopefully take away most of those markings. And some artists actually put their piece indoors or put it in a closed box while it's drying so it doesn't sit outside where it can more easily get dust particles on it. Topic we will go over is following instructions on the can. So I use the Golden brand, and here are some of the things that it says on the can which I need to follow when varnishing. So the first is I need to make sure that I shake the can for at least 2 minutes before using. Okay. I need to keep the can a distance of 9 to 12 inches away from the artwork. I need to start and stop spraying off of the artwork, meaning I am going to start on either side of the artwork and go through the full surface and also end off the artwork. And this is so you don't get big blobs of varnish on anywhere on the piece. Okay, and then I will need to wait 15 to 20 minutes in between each coat before I add the next layer. And I also need to change direction and turn the piece in between the coats. So if I start with it upright, I will spray it, and then once that layer dries, I will turn it 90 degrees, and I will keep turning with every layer, I'll keep turning the rotation 90 degrees. That way you don't get any lines and it comes out evenly. And after the last coat, I will allow several hours before handling. Personally, I move the piece indoors and I don't touch it or frame it for at least 48 hours. And this last one is one of the biggest lessons that I learned, and that is do not let any packaging material touch the varnished artwork surface. And we will go over that more later in this video. Next, I want to go over a few tips from Ampersand, and I'm going to read directly from their email just so I don't miss anything. So the first is always spray the work when it is sitting upright. Because spraying a piece that is laying down can result in uneven application and it is vulnerable to more splatter and debris. And also, spray cans don't really work unless they're standing upright. And as like the can says, begin the spray stream with the can pointed away from the work. Once you have that even mist, you'll move the constant spray in a left to right motion, passing beyond the edge of the panel and then back again, slightly overlapping each pass. And make this like a continuous motion, even and steady, don't go too fast or too slow. They said this is a silly suggestion, but the Beatles song Taxman is actually about the right tempo for the movement. And when you get to the bottom of the work, don't stop. You'll want to work your way back up the way you came to the top again, and don't take your finger off the nozzle until the can is pointed away from the piece. And last, let each coat dry sufficiently. Applying the next coat while it is still wet can cause them to mix together, which can result in the coat being too thick and could cause inconsistent layers or affect drying time and cause tackiness. As mentioned earlier, one of the most dreaded risks of varnishing scratchboard artwork is getting those little tiny white specks, or what we call snow. And this is usually the result of one of two things. The first is varnishing in too much humidity. Luckily, Ampersand did give me a fix for this, and the key is gloss varnish spray. So say you start with your first layer of the preferred varnish that you like, so whether that's matte or satin. If you get the snow on that first layer, then you can use the second layer as the gloss varnish spray, and that should melt the layers enough to disappear or make the white specks disappear. You can try a few coats of the gloss varnish if it doesn't work right away. Of course, letting each layer dry in between, and then you can finish with the next couple layers as your preferred varnish. And I have found that when I get snow, it's typically only in the first layer, so what I'll do is I always do my first layer of the satin varnish, and then I'll always go in with one layer of gloss just to even everything out, make sure there's no snow, and then I'll go in with 3 or 4 more layers of my preferred satin varnish, and until I total about 5 layers. Some artists only do 3 or 4 layers. It's really just personal preference on the texture and the look that you're going for. Also, I would recommend using the same brand if you are going to mix like the matte and the satin with the gloss to get rid of the snow. I would recommend using the same brand, whether you use Krylon, Golden, or another brand. Or if you do have different ones, just make sure you test it on a small scrapboard before you test it on your final piece. The second reason you might have gotten snow is because you did not shake the can well enough before use. And in these cases, the snow can be extreme, like big splotchy patches of white. I personally have not experienced this before, but I am in a scratchboard group on Facebook, which I will post the link below, and I have seen people post pictures of this disaster happening. And in these cases, I would highly recommend searching for that in the Facebook group and reading the comments for what they recommend. Some things that I might recommend is trying the gloss varnish spray for 1 or 2 layers, and if it just does not budge. I have read other comments from other artists who say that you can use steel wool or a fine sandpaper to try and wipe it off very carefully. Also, storing your can at room temperature is really important, and this comes directly from Ampersand. They say don't let your can sit where it can get too hot or too cold. If it does get too cold, you can sit it in warm water for about 15 minutes to warm up before you use it. Next, Next, I want to touch on storing your varnished pieces, as I ruined about 5 of my first pieces because I was not mindful of what the can said. As it had mentioned, do not let packaging material touch the varnished artwork surface. So when I first started, I had gotten several pieces built up and I just wanted to get them varnished, get it out of the way, but I wasn't ready to frame them yet. So my plan was to get them varnished and then just store them until I was ready to frame and show them. So I had a big varnishing day. I varnished 5 pieces, and mind you, I let them fully dry for several days before I stored them. So once they were dry, I ended up putting backing boards in between them, like the white cardboard backing boards. And in some of them, I put them back in the plastic packaging that they came in just for further protection. And I had let them sit for probably like a month before I took them out the first time, and they were fine. It wasn't until several months after that where one day I went to look at them and the pieces were fully stuck to the backing board. So I had to peel them apart. It left the white cardboard residue all over the pieces. And the ones that were left in the plastic wrap, they ended up like melting a texture into the artwork, completely ruining it. So moral of the story, if the can says don't let the varnished artwork touch any packaging material, just be mindful of that. So you will either need to A, leave the pieces unvarnished and you can store them protectively however you want in a file or a box, just protective until you are ready to varnish and frame them, or B, frame them after you varnish them and once they are fully dry, because the frame is going to be lifted so that way when you wrap the frame up, it's not going to actually be touching the artwork surface. And a note on framing, along with these 5 pieces, I had also ruined another piece because I decided to frame it behind glass after it was varnished. Normally, I would not frame my Varnish Scratchboard work behind glass. It was just a preference for where I was going to show the piece at the time. And of course, over time, it has developed tiny bubbles and markings between the artwork and the glass, and the artwork is fully stuck to the glass now, so it is pretty much ruined. So again, nothing should sit on top of the varnished work. So for framing, you have 2 options. You can either frame the varnished artwork without glass, or you can leave it unvarnished and frame it with glass. And if you do this, I would recommend museum non-reflective glass. It will look better. But keep in mind that Scratchboard really looks better varnished because it makes it look much more polished and vibrant. So this is definitely, option A is definitely the preference for most Scratchboard artists. That we will get into before we get into the demonstration is the protective gear. So you will want a ventilator to protect your lungs and protective goggles to protect your eyes. And you can get these at any hardware store like Home Depot or Lowe's or anywhere like that. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into the demonstration. So I'm about to varnish this piece. We will try and get the camera as close as possible without possibly damaging the lens. So as you can see, I have this piece on a table easel, and behind that is a piece of cardboard for the backing to set it upright, and then I have some newspaper over that. The reason for the newspaper is because over time, the varnish leaves little white hardened particles that just build up, and when the piece is drying, they can fly off like dust and stick to the piece. So I change this out like once every other time or so. And I also have a cloth over the table to protect that as well. So I'm going to be starting with my preferred satin golden varnish spray. So I'm going to put my protective gear on first. I will then shake the can for 2 minutes. Remember, that's very important to shake it as much as it says on the can. And then I'm going to hold it about 9 to 12 inches away from the piece. I will start on either side of the piece, and once I get a steady, even spray going, I will go back and forth, sweeping across it, and I will also end off of the artwork. This is so you don't get those blotches and you want to get that even spray going. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll gear up and then we'll get ready to spray. Okay. All right, so now you can see, if you can see on the reflection, it is fully wet. I'm just gonna look around a little bit for splotchiness and see if there's any snow. I will be able to see more once it dries, but this is looking really good so far. So we are going to go ahead and let this dry for 15 to 20 minutes. I'm gonna set my timer and we'll be out to do the next layer in just a bit. All right, so it has been 20 minutes. The piece is dry enough now for us to start the next layer. First, I'm just gonna go look through and see if I see any dust particles that need to come off. There are just a few tiny little white specks I can just brush off really gently with my finger. Make sure the hand is flat so your nail isn't there. There's a couple little tiny white specks in there, but those should go away as we build up the layers. But everything else so far looks really good. So now I'm going to turn it 90 degrees. Remember, every layer we do, we want to turn it 90 degrees so it gets even layers and there's no lines that come up. And next, I am going to go ahead and use the gloss version now. Okay, so you can see back here. We're going to use a layer of this. Remember, if you don't get snow, you do not have to use a layer of the gloss. This is just how I've always done it. So I am going to go ahead and use one layer of the gloss. Okay, so let's go ahead and gear up. Zoom in a little bit here. Okay. All right. We will go ahead and wait for about 15-20 minutes again. So while the piece was drying, we had a bug land on the piece and get stuck. I did use the tweezers and got most of him off. It was right about there. And then a piece of hair, which you can kind of see there, is now stuck on the board. So I'm waiting just a few more minutes and then I'm going to try and get that off with the tweezers. So these are just some things that can happen when you're varnishing. Sometimes it will be a good idea to bring the piece indoors to dry if you can. That way nothing blows, or if the breeze picks up, nothing can land on it. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so we were able to get the little bug and the piece of hair off of the board. Unfortunately, it did leave a little bit of like a 3D indent because it was embedded in the gloss varnish when it was drying. But the next few layers should get rid of it, no problem. And it is getting quite breezy out, so I'm going to take the piece inside to dry for the next few layers and I'll take it back out to varnish it. So definitely take your piece indoors or put it in a box when it's drying if it starts to get breezy out. And I'm going to switch to my preferred satin varnish for the rest of the layers. We'll do another 3 or so layers and see just how it looks, and we'll go ahead and gear up again and get the next layer on after I turn it 90 degrees. Okay. Okay. So the third layer has just finished drying, and it did indeed take away the hair and the bug markings, so everything looks great again. And you can see as we start to build up these layers, it starts to build this subtle texture, which I just love. So it's building up, it's starting to look really finished. I am going to go ahead, I just rotated it, so I'm going to do the 4th layer and then one more 5th layer, and I will follow back up once the 5th layer has dried. So the 5th layer has initially dried. I will now wait 2 to 3 days before I frame it and then ship it off to its new home. Here you can see the type of finish that the satin varnish leaves. This is a mix between the matte and the gloss varnishes. So it's not going to be as dull and non-reflective as the matte, and it's not going to be quite as reflective and shiny as the gloss. So I like this in-between one. A lot of scratchboard artists like the matte one. And then I know quite a few others who like the satin as well. So I recommend just trying different ones out and seeing which one you prefer. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope this video was helpful for you. As I mentioned earlier, I will post the link to the Scratchboard Facebook group I am in the description below. I highly recommend joining because there are so many Scratchboard artists that are great resources, especially for this medium where there aren't as many readily available resources online. Like compared to acrylic and oil, the Scratchboard group is a wonderful resource. I also highly recommend finding Scratchboard artists on Instagram. There are several of us. I will post my handle in a link below as well as in the next few seconds. So thank you all again, and I wish you the best of luck in learning to varnish your pieces.